Okay, are we ready? Yes. So just to begin and get a sense of the room, maybe I could just have a raise of hands of you all that work at an institution currently. Sorry, that currently work at an institution, at a cultural institution. Are there any policymakers here in the room? Policymakers. Policymakers, people that work in government or in advocate groups that write policy, right? And are there any artists in the room? Okay, great. So that's just to get a sense. So I'm going to begin by very briefly introducing my curricular practice and how it pertains to the institutional work that I develop, and the ways that through a concept around collective learning, I'm going to present one case that we developed at the institution that I think is a case that is in an early stage, but it's one case that enables, to my mind, institutional change that has a ripple effect in society in terms of how we perceive culture, how people can perceive culture, and not just, say, contemporary art. My practice begins, I've been working in the field, in the art sector, visual art specifically, for 20 years now. And I am now in the Netherlands for the last year and a half, after being in New York for a long time. And I went there to study. But I grew up in a small town in Mexico, in the border of the United States. So where President Trump says that they're going to build a wall, basically I grew up in the Mexican side of where the wall is going to be constructed, although there has been a very large fence that has divided the country of the United States and, of course, Mexico. In that context, the town is called Mexicali. It's very small, or was very small, much smaller when I grew up than it is now. It's a border town in the capital city of Baja California, so it's in the northwest of Mexico, bordering the state of California in the United States. And at that time, in the 80s and 90s, really it happened at the brink of the early 90s, there was a major economic shift that had to do with the signing of the national, or what's called the North American Free Trade Agreement, that paired basically Mexico with the United States and Canada for a trade agreement that basically transformed the border region of Mexico into what is now known as like a production and manufacturing site. Obviously for products that would be produced or manufactured in Mexico at very low wages and then cross the border between here and where the tree is basically, and that get distributed within the economic distribution of the United States. So that hometown and that region in general of the border was a region that saw itself with a lot of makers in terms of a chain production and very few, I would say, creators, meaning everyone there, the wealth was coming from people that owned land and that equipped it to become industrial parks where the maquiladoras, which were the factories, set up. And they were like the landowners that acquired a capital that they didn't have before. And the majority of the population then worked for these companies. And for those companies, meaning being in the production lines or in the administrative lines. That really marked a generation, I would say, in Mexico. And that had to do with the fact that everyone there was a producer and not necessarily a creator, meaning we were producing for a larger machine of products that in fact did not stay in the country, but that were exported. So everyone had a very, I would say, lower status in terms of participating in culture. At the time of my early years there, the only small museum that was there was a city museum, a regional museum that collected some of the artifacts that were collected in that northern area of Mexico, which didn't have the glorious civilizations of the Aztec or Mayan period. Most of the indigenous communities in the northwest of Mexico, as it is in the southwest of California, were nomadic groups that in that desert region sort of moved around. So there was not big constructions nor a big crafts movement that left a lot of vestiges there. So the small museum presented a number of works on clay and some images of the arte rupestre or rock art that was found in the desert region there, which sort of pointed out to the migration and to the flow of the indigenous communities that settled there temporarily and continued moving. That is a context of it having grown up. So small museum eventually sold to the university because the city did not have the resources to maintain it, and then within the university, now it operates much more as a small permanent display that in addition has a number of temporary exhibitions of which the researchers are not even cited at the university. That village, which is now a city and still a capital, now has many people. And many people, I mean nearly 1 million people. And most of them, again, work in the service sector or in the production sector. Within that context, still not yet a museum has been constructed. So in a way, during my youth, the first significant experience that I had, and that was really life-changing and has led me to be where I'm at right now at Witte de With, which I'll talk about, was a public art project that happened in the 90s in the border region of Tijuana and San Diego, which is just further east from my hometown. That project was called Insight, and it really had to do with the emergence and since the 70s, but the strong support to site-specific art. And I don't know if that term is maybe new to some. For those that do not know the term site-specific art, maybe just raise your hand so that I could go into the flow. Everyone has heard about site-specific art, great. So site-specific art at that time, or within the context and framework of that project, basically consisted of inviting a number of artists to participate, to come to the border region and to develop through a residency program of about 3 visits during the course of a year, or of an extended visit about 3 months, and an artwork that would be cited in that border region. The artist could choose either to do it in the Mexican side or in the American side, but that in a way would address the historical and architectural or the urban culture from there. Okay, so I'll come closer.
And the microphone.
Is
there a microphone?
I suggest everyone do the shares.
Yeah, just maybe a little bit more. Just to be short with this, for me it was being young at that time, in my late teens, what was very inspirational was not only that meeting all these artists that were coming, there were a number of artists, 42 to be exact, that had come. We're talking, this is the year 1997. And 42 artists were coming into the region, and my task as an intern at that time was to drive them to different places in the city and to hang out with them basically as they concocted their ideas, what they wanted to do, what they felt interested in, what they were more inclined to visit. Some of the artists preferred more to go to either dentist shops, which are very popular in the border region because it's so expensive in the United States, with the lack of dental insurance, that people just cross the border, go to their dentist, and then go back and serve. So the services that artists were looking at were dentists, they were looking at tourism spots. Some artists were interested in the maquiladoras and all those Sony, Samsung, all those companies that had set up in the border region. Some artists were interested in visiting bars and other spaces where the nightlives or minority groups hang out and so on. During that period of time, I learned so much of the context of the place that I had been born and raised, but that I didn't really know. But it was through the artists and their interests that I got a sense of the city outside of the normative sectors and associations that one experiences the city, whether it's through school or through your families or through clubs. So it was through arts and through the artists that I got to just experience a whole different vision of that place. But the most important, the most relevant aspect of that learning was that when the exhibition was up, which was a year later, all the art installations were cited as public art that was cited across the region. So you had a map and you traveled around the city. What was very interesting and to me life-changing was that you didn't need museums to actually acknowledge that art can be not only produced, which it always has, but could be presented to a public. Meaning that you needed a setup, a structure to allow for the general public that is not exactly going to museums, because for example we didn't have one, to actually experience an artistic language, in this case through the visual arts, a number of things. And in addition, that museums were not just the only site where legacies were being constructed or where that experience and knowledge to the art was being provided, but that it was through systems of communication, through maps that pointed to things, through information and mediation that was there. And that it was life-changing, because even if you were from there, I'm not talking about the globe-trotting audience that travels to see biennales, I'm talking about the local audiences that were there. They, like me being local, got a sense of our city, again, outside of the institutional structures that mediate our relationship to urban space, or to culture in general. Again, most of the experience is through our families or through our education, meaning the schools that we go to and the field trips that they do, through the clubs that we're allowed to, or through a sense of personal curiosity that you go defining, but very rarely do you encounter things outside of those institutions, or now with social media, outside of the bubbles that the algorithms have assigned you. So just as a principle, site specificity in terms of art making was instrumental to my formation, to my intellectual formation, and through my demands, so to say, of institutions and my expectations of the arts as well. Meaning the way I wanted to relate to the arts and to artists specifically was that we would learn something that's not in school or not within our sector, not within our field of specialization, but that we would learn about our cities, about our histories, about other cultures through their work, through their art making. And site-specific, or site specificity, was then very important for when I arrived to Witte de With. I arrived in 2018, and as I said in my brief introduction, when I arrived there had been just a major crisis a couple of months before, in which the cultural sector in Rotterdam, and then eventually in the Netherlands, because it rippled, was very critical and very open about their critique of our institution's name. And the critique came along with one, the most visible out of many other critiques around that are propelled by decolonizing efforts that are being done in many countries, the Netherlands being one of them. The critique pretty much went that our name, Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, was actually referring to a colonial history of the 17th century, specifically through the experience or through the expeditions of the East India Company, called VOC as an abbreviation, during the 17th century. And that a lot of the history, or all of it pretty much, was always spoken as the golden age, meaning that the narration of that period of the 17th century that created the wealth base of the Netherlands was only spoken in terms of the economic and artistic glories in which the country developed at that time and in which still enjoys. And the critique then went that the other part of that history, the untold part, which involves enslavement, which involves destruction of environment, which involves many other things that are not exactly negative, was never told. And that the name Witte de With was associated to that. So the critique went, how, if you present your institution as a critical institution that thinks about contemporary art and presents it, how is it that you have not thought about the fact that you're having a name, Witte de With, that is associated, that is uncritically associating it to a history that it doesn't even tell? So the institution promised to change its name, and they said, the next director is coming in a couple of months, she's going to take care of them. And I'm like, oh. So, and behold, I arrived at an institution that was in a context that was significantly polarized. Polarized tremendously. So it was in the newspapers the entire time. Tomorrow I will have another interview with another journalist, because this moment, and because Witte de With has been such an important institution for the country, that everyone is expecting us to be part of a change or to be exemplary in that change. So it's quite a stressful period. But one of the things that I said is, hold your horses. The first thing people said, what is the name, that is the new name going to be? And what I thought was interesting was, from that question, was that the question wasn't, how will you change the name? Or if you change the name, what will change? So what I thought first, having come from a period of site-specific art, having come from a period of really thinking about context, not only a context in a social and economic way, but also thinking about the very site that we work was. We're going to begin first with the question of why were we even named Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art. The locals know that the name comes from the name of our street, which is Witte de With Straat. And that is the name of the naval Dutch officer, one of several, that was in charge of one of the important expeditions of the VOC during the 17th century, and that was sited in Batavia. The name of our street is not unique. There are 17 other streets in the country that are called Witte de With Straat. What was interesting as well, what was pointed out in the critiques, was that it's not only the name of a person that was associated in the VOC, that was cited in Batavia, and that history tells, even the good history, tells that he was like a disaster, that this guy was bloody, that his conduct was to be shamed even at that time. So it's not right now that we're doing a revisionist history that this Witte de With man was a very fierce naval Dutch officer. It was written even at that time. See? So it's not exactly that they have chosen or that his name was one of the so-called heroes that did so many great things. He was also one of the people that, besides being an officer, had been very critiqued during his lifetime. Okay, point aside, the critique when it came from the cultural critics in 2017 was a critique that not only did it associate to the 17th century colonial period of the Netherlands, but that it is also associated to just a very basic translation of whiter than white, meaning that Witte de With is, beside a proper name, also stands for kind of set of nouns and adjectives that explain that something is whiter than white. And of course, that was part of the source of the critique as well. The critique then that was pointing out was not only in terms of questions around race, but also questions that I would say has to do with the Western canon of art history, meaning how the so-called dominant writing of art history has been primarily led or primarily taught through the notions of beauty that had been written particularly in North America and in Europe. And so the whiter than white critique is not just a question, as I said, of race, but one of canon, meaning the hegemonic narratives or the most important narratives that have been at least circulated the most in terms of what art is, what the fine arts consist of, how do we understand them, what are their periods, and then everything else that falls out of that is something just simply other, right? So that's the critique. And I think there's many more aspects of that, but basically what I want to go back is then to the street. So the first question that I said is like, why were we even named that way? And okay, the locals know that that's Witte de With Straat, and that's Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art. It is known that throughout the 20th century, and still up until today, many contemporary art centers, beyond questions around site specificity, were named as their address, their street address. So in a way, it was part of a trend in the 20th century that you didn't name your art institution or your salon or your museum necessarily based on the name or the denomination of what you were going to be doing, say contemporary art, but that to be so-called neutral, you named it based on your location. And the idea for many had to do with the place of discussion or the place of gathering that you wanted to point out. So you wanted to point out to the location or to the people, not necessarily because of its history, but because you wanted there to be a gathering. So Witte de With is named based on the street with no other intention than to speak to itself as being a place in the city that in fact had not been visited. And that's part of its construction. And I'll give a little bit example. Has anyone been to Witte de With from here? Okay, great. So at least some people, great. So you can imagine, I don't know when was the last time or when was the first time that you went, but it's significantly changed, and that's what I'm going to talk about it. And that is our building. And that is a street way long ago. In fact, this is a photograph taken before the war, the Second World War, and this one as well. And I want you to get a sense of where we are in the city. It's where the yellow dot is here. And this is the city center just before the Second World War. And this is the city center just after. Rotterdam, up until recently, was the most active and biggest port in the world. Shanghai has taken that over. And as a port city, it was a strategic place that in the world map. And during the Second World War, it was significantly bombed, basically. And most of the city center was completely destroyed. Witte de With, which is there, and still there, was just in the margin outside. We're still in the center, in the historic center, called the Cool District to be specific, but it's just outside of the range of bombing that took place. So the city was by and large reconstructed after the war, and our building remained. It's a building that you might have read right now in the first place that was constructed in the 19th century, in 1871, 1873. And it was originally constructed as a school, specifically a school for women. And it was called Hogeberger School, which was a new type of educational plan that the Netherlands had just initiated at that time, the late 19th century, which is an operative term right now to mention, that created all these schools in the country. A new educational plan rolled out, this one specifically for women. The boys' school or the men's school was just around, and you could think of this as a kind of high school. I don't know how they're called here in terms of the age range, a middle school, high school in terms of age of the 19th century. That's actually pretty early in terms of the advancement of the educational sector in the Netherlands, and I think that that's a point to remark on. It was really in the 19th century, there's a couple of years just of difference, only 2 years of difference, when the school was built and when the street, Witte de With was renamed to what it is today. And I think that there is a connection, and I'm not alone in thinking this, that there is a connection between the construction of a new educational plan and buildings for that, in this case, a women's school, high school, with the denomination of street names in the Netherlands to have names related to the 17th century or to the golden age of the East India Company. And the relationship of that, if we study museum studies, for example, Tony Bennett being one of the main authors around the history of museums, and specifically the change of museums in the 19th century, we understand that it was during this period of time when most countries were interested and developing plans for national identity, creating new forms or new signs that would be important for the new kind of citizen that the countries wanted. A modern citizen, a citizen that had taste, a citizen that was cultured, a citizen that was informed. So 19th century, many of the countries took different aspects of their culture to revive them and to take them between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Every country, not every, but many countries that were participating in programs around the building of a new national identity were using culture and cultural identity as the ways in which it would identify itself. In the case of Mexico, for example, in the late 19th century, we had Porfirio Diaz there, who was eventually known as a dictator. He was in power for 40 years, and eventually in the early 1910, removed from position of power after the revolution. But his model, which was about implementing modernity in Mexico, he created the first telegraph system, the trains, all these things that we're very happy to have had, but certainly it came at a very huge cost. Those implications for our country, Mexico, at that time, they were French. He adored French culture, and most of the images that were used of glory and of success and modernity around that time were inspired by French culture. So you could see the building architecture, you could see many different aspects. In 1910, when the revolution happened, these signs for the cultural identity were changed completely, and they were indigenous, right? And now you have the relationship with Mexico through the muralists that were about indigeneity and people and so on. So that's just to say an example. I'm sure that in Sweden, there was also a rise in the 19th century of certain items, certain signs, certain images and symbols that were eventually promoted in the decades to come, and that is now part of the semiotics, so to say, of what a culture is here. There in the Netherlands, the street name and the construction name or the construction year of the building are tied because of culture and obviously education. What I'm interested in recovering from that time is a number of things. One, first of all, to be able to create an institutional history for Witte de With, our institution, still named that way, and I'll tell you a little bit of the process, by using our history, as many of the artists and curators have participated since the 1990s in doing its specificity, meaning we are first going to understand how we came about to become with that name. What does that name stand in the 19th century? Meaning, what did it mean in the 19th century when the street was named there? What does that same name mean in the late 80s and 90s when our institution was founded, which was in 1990? And what does it mean today? Meaning to do a kind of historical investigation and then to do a comparative analysis between the different moments, 19th century or late 19th, late 20th century and early 20th century in terms of the significance of a name at different time. When we were founded in 1990, and I'll stop here in the images and I'll come back to that. Site specificity was also in vogue. In the 1980s, one of the things that had happened in Rotterdam, which was a major moment of urban development, there was one in the 1950s, which reconstructed the city center. And then in the 1980s, there was a lot of planning by policymakers, really, that would be based on how do we activate the city center? Meaning, how do people stop going out and living in the surroundings of Rotterdam, and how do we actually begin activating the city center? And their proposal was to create more density, right? To create new buildings, taller buildings that would generate more density in the city center so that the city would be much more alive, so that the people didn't have to live elsewhere and then work and commute, but that they actually activated the center and used it as a city. And the second thing was to identify those points in the city, including Witte de With, that seemed vulnerable. And that seemed vulnerable because they hadn't been attended and they had become places of just parties and late nights and many other things that they said, we must do something within that street. And so the school, that's important, Witte de With. The school and the architecture, I want to show you again the building so that you can see the distinction between the tower up there with the bell, the entrance. These are going to be important images later. And then the construction there without the bell, and then the new floor that's there. But the city basically decided that one of the things to do was to urbanize that place in a different way, and that the only way that it could do, or that the way that they thought it could do, is actually by creating a cultural axis. The school operated still in the 1980s in Witte de With. It was, meaning since the 19th century, it had been a school and it remained being a school. There had been some changes within the pedagogical program. The street was still a little bit shady, but it continued. And I'm going to run you through some of the images just so that we can also understand the changing times based on just the photography of the students. This is one of the earliest photographs we found in the archives in the city. And these are 20 years later, and you can see the significant difference. And I will say, not in terms of the color or the quality of the photograph, but specifically in terms of the decor and the dress of the students.
So that's 1910.
This is about, actually this is like around 1930. Okay. So it's even longer. The first photograph is around 1910, yeah. And there are strong distinctions, and I would say strong distinctions throughout the photographs. You can see, and I like this one particularly, there's many, but I like this one particularly because this is still not an image that you could relate to the Netherlands, which is very minimal in its decor and in its presentation. So here the exotic aspects of both the Persian rug and then the animal rugs are quite impressive, I would say, let alone the backdrop. There's a more modernizing image. This garden no longer exists, it's galleries now. This gym building still exists, and it's a space actually that we rent to a space called Tent. I'm going to leave it there for now because I'm going to speak about this floor plan specifically. So one of the things that the city decided was that the street, this is in the 1980s, was in the center, or that it connected actually two major museums in Rotterdam. The Maritime Museum, which is pretty much devoted to the activities of the port to a large extent, and then the art museum called the Boymans Museum, and it was connected to a park that is now where the Kunsthalle and the new Institute of Books and Architecture is. And that Witte de With was a street that would go from one museum to all these other museum parks that were there. And something was missing in the center, so that the nightlife was not just occupying that transit area between these two cultural spots. So in the 80s, two centers had closed. One of them was in a shopping mall in the Limebine, which is considered the first shopping mall, open-air shopping mall in Europe. And that was called the Limebine Arts Center, and it pretty much focused like a kind of Kunsthal, not as we know them today, but as a kind of exhibition space where the city just sent projects that were either of cars or of arts or of fashion. And another one that was a contemporary arts gallery, non-profit, called Venster Gallery, that had been showing primarily artists actually from New York. Both those spaces were closed in the mid-80s. And when the city said we have to create something new and concentrated. So a group of policymakers, four men I would say, went to different cities in the world, specifically in Europe. They went to Marseille, they went to London, they went to a couple of other places to understand what a contemporary art center was doing in these cities. And they concocted a place like Witte de With. They brought, at the late 80s, Chris Durkin, who I'm not sure if you know, but you know Chris Durkin, good. He's quite an interesting figure, very controversial in Berlin, as we know it. But he has done a lot of institutional work. And he was working at that time as the director of exhibitions at PS1 in New York City, now which is part of that. He was brought in to create a program of exhibitions at a place called Witte de With that was going to be focused in art and theory, contemporary art and theory. Those two terms are actually quite important because they're also very 80s, like site-specific art was for the 90s. And he basically said, I will arrive there and we'll create a series of exhibitions. The institution was planned to run for about a year and no more. Of course, now we're celebrating our 30th year next year, which means that it's done a number of work. When it arrived, the school continued operating, and basically, and I will be quicker so because I'm seeing the time, I will do this quicker. Continued operating in the bottom floors, and Witte de With was asked by the city to operate in the two abandoned floors of the building, meaning the school was still working there, but in the 2 floors upstairs, the city said you can have these 2 floors to begin your program. And it was then operating with building downstairs of school, and then in the 2 floors of the building, exhibitions and their offices. And that's where all the program came. At that time, the school was technical. It was no longer a women's school, but in fact it had a whole program which is part of what's called in the Netherlands MBO, which is how students get separated between the humanities and skill set oriented education when they're in middle school. The building, when it became a technical school, did change, so it was modernized as well with that top floor building, which is actually right now even larger. It's a full site, and today our main exhibition space. Now, one of the things that happened in the 30 years that we've been there is that Witte de With arrived, began making exhibitions. The school eventually left the 2 floors. Witte de With took up the entire building. It bought it actually in 1997. The school relocated, became bigger in a new modern building, and we occupied the entire building since then. The building, though, was not only a very important center for contemporary art on an international scene, but it also attracted many artist-run spaces and smaller cultural initiatives to be sited within the street. So once a street that had been the site for the newspaper and that had left, that had been the site for the photo museum and then had left, became again a site for arts and culture. If you had gone to Witte de With in the early 1990s, the street would have been looking a little bit sketchy. If you go to the street now that it's considered the main tourist spot of the city, the street is completely gentrified. And by that I mean there are more cafes concentrated in that area than in the rest of the city in general. The real estate there is extremely high, and basically Witte de With, even though it owns its building, is one of the institutions that in fact does not have a permit to actually celebrate and make profits out of everyone else in the street. But what was important there is not only that we had bought the building and felt and have been feeling very well, but about 10 years ago, the director at that time, Nicolas Schaufhausen, had already considered that there was something missing in the situation that we were in, and that what was missing was actually a contact with the city itself. So even though we were at the center of the city and the institution had helped urbanize all that area, or gentrify if you want to call it, all that area, there was real no direct contact with the city. I foresee that some of the critiques of Witte de With in terms of a name or in terms of being whiter than white are thus not just a question of the 17th century animation. It was not a question just of what it means symbolically of whiter than white or the canon of art history in that sense, but also its direct relationship that it has on the level of the passers-by. So an idea came up to Nicolas Schaufhausen that didn't really fully, I would say, trigger good results until I think more recently, which was that the windows in the building, and that's why I think that this has to do with enduring change, is that it's infrastructure and not just only themes, is that the building had to change, that at least by the very act of lowering down its windows from having them black and tall, look at that man there so you can see the proportion, but actually by lowering down the windows, that you could have a direct access to the contents of the space. The only one thing that happened was that during that entire time, even though the windows were lowered in the last 4 years, or in the last 3 years, between 2014 and 2017, during that period, that space that was directly accessible to the street, that was to be much more welcoming and have a much more direct contact with the city, was still somewhat inaccessible. And by that I mean that the exhibitions that were presented there remained using the white cube model as an example, meaning the artwork was autonomous, the institution defined it, the admission was €6, the entrance is still huge with very heavy doors, meaning that there's no didactics, meaning that it followed the conventions of any other exhibition that was being held upstairs. No direct contact with any kind of sign other than having lowered the windows to showcase rather than to relate. And I think that was one of the key differences that happened there. So at my arrival there at Witte de With, and to think of the fact that I had to change the name, I said, okay, we'll start then, and to think that if there's going to be a name change, which is symbolic, and this is a space where the symbolic gets negotiated, the first thing that we're going to do is change the way in which we relate to people, change the way in which we relate to our own spaces. And that doesn't mean that art doesn't have a space there, but that it has to have a different kind of space, a different kind of presentation, that it's going to occupy the space differently, but also that it's going to be welcoming people differently, and that it's going to happen in different stages. So first was to create then, in that same gallery space downstairs, which used to be the drawing room, and that's why I wanted to show you the floor plans of the actual school in the late 19th century and the 1950s, how this very space was used from the street. It was a drawing room of the art school in the first part of the 20th century, and then a technical room and a cantina in the second part of the 20th century. Then it became the white cube, and now it's what I call just a simple multi-purpose space. So before changing the name, the first thing that we've done, and it's happened already now for 14 months, has been to change the uses of our space from the street level, and then progressively upstairs in the rest of the building. So to progressively change the name, to progressively change the uses, to progressively change the culture. In order to do this, and also because our funding is policymakers here, our funding comes for presentation of art. We're not a museum, we don't have a collection, but instead we apply it to a section within the Ministry of Education that is funding to institutions that present art. And so that multi-purpose space then cannot just be any kind of space, it has to be a presentation space so that it can work also within the policy. So everything then in that space is art. Furniture is designed by Manuel Rader, who's based in Berlin. The painting, the mural, which envelops the entire building, is created by an artist called Federico Herrero. The archives that we have there, and I could show you, these archives there are always exhibiting art. There are 2 vitrines devoted to works on paper or to exhibitions of archives. And then every single event that we've had there, this is a team, and every single event that we've had there is always presenting something that has to do with a new maker, with an artist that's emerging, with an idea that's emerging, but that it's presented by the arts. The space has changed significantly, and one of the key changes is the second component that goes in par with the space, which is having created a position at Witte de With that addresses diversity in every sense of the way. The position is for a curator because everyone wants to apply for curatorial positions, I have to say. So you add the word curator there and your applications go much higher. And I think that has to do with the decision making process that a curator sort of represents. It's someone that actually makes decisions. And that means that it's not someone that just organizes things, but someone that decides the way in which they should even be organized. And that position was, instead of a curator of art, it's a curator of collective learning. And the way in which the space emerged at the same time, in fact, a couple of months before, with the presentation of the new position. That new position would be then in charge of programming in the space. Her name is Jessie Koyman. She was hired already last year. But not only programming the space, but also someone that in principle would come from a very different set of expertise or knowledge that the institution was known for. So Witte de With has been an institution that has been very forward-thinking and has been in fact at the forefront in exhibition making and in publication production. Most of the exhibitions that it does are of artists that may have been underrepresented within the mainstream, but the exhibitions have served as a springboard to be noticed and for new scholarship to be addressed. So most of the exhibitions there have advanced the field of art history in significant ways. And I could speak of specific exhibitions that have happened since the foundation of the 1990s, but that's not the forum right now, and we could talk about that later over coffee. But basically, all the people that have come to work there come with a very strong expertise in contemporary art, and specifically through art history, or in what's considered contemporary theory, now called discourse, but a very key term in terms of post-colonial studies during the 1980s, and was what defined very much the program of Chris Durkin there in the early 90s, in terms of what was the vanguard of the moment, the way things needed to change, the discourses that needed to be included, the medium or the specificity of site that needed to be addressed. The position that came there, and in order to be able to open up to other forms of knowledge, was very much a position that was announced through an open call that didn't require specific academic background. And it's not because we were looking for anyone just like that, but that we understood that if we wanted to be more attentive to other forms of knowledge, we couldn't use the same evaluation system that in the field of our profession was expected or standardized. So the open call, and is what we've been doing now, pretty much describe what the responsibilities are and describe the character and expertise that the person could have that would allow for them to develop the best they could in the position that we have. So in order for us to address diversity, we had to address, not be intersectional to begin with, and address expertise that is formed or embodied, knowledge that is embodied, and not that is institutional, not that is a credit history of the schools or the projects that you've developed, but instead of the type of work that you've developed before. So the open call was debated. Some people attacked it and critiqued it because of its vagueness. Some people appreciated it because of the description. But ultimately, there were a number of hundreds of people that applied, well, not hundreds, but over 100 people that applied for the position. And in the interview process, we selected Jessie for a couple of reasons. One, she did a very good interview, which is, I think allows for that. But she was someone that was coming from the care system and that eventually entered into the art system. Meaning she was someone that went to art school much later in life, having worked and been trained as a caretaker. And for me, what was interesting of that was not only the expertise that she could join from the art school and from caretaking school, but more so because it represented a shift and a decision-making process within her own life to say, this is what I should be doing because I've been trained to do this, and this is what I really want to do. So it presented the intersectionality there directly. Yeah? A nurse. A nurse. So in the, just as a footnote there, because I'm sure that it's different here in Sweden, in most immigrant societies, meaning cities that have many immigrants, caretaking is one of the professions or the oficios of immigrants. And that has to do because it's secure. First of all, because there's policy that allows for people to immigrate if they actually go to nursing school, that's one. But also it goes on through different generations in the family because it's a secure income. And that's one of the things. And it has to do with, you kind of get locked in also within professions or again, oficios, which I don't know how you call it in English. But it is not only a very dignified work, but it's also work that has been associated to a large extent in not being able to have social mobility. Okay? So that those are the technical schoolings that you can have, and it's very difficult to go into the humanities, the so-called thinking skills, which of course there's involved thinking, but it's a kind of class denomination that's there. So to see as a leader in an institution, I would say is that, or in my position that I was there, to be able to notice that decision-making actually happens on an individual level and not an institutional level is very important to say that we can actually create change with people that have already changed their own condition. See? So that they do not have necessarily the expertise of the field in terms of what other candidates could bring, but they at least have a risk that they've already achieved, that they already surpassed, to be able to arrive and to participate in other risk-taking decisions that an institution as a whole can take. And I think that that's actually essential. So on the one hand, transformation of the uses of the space. So it's the same architecture. We didn't do a huge renovation, right? It's the same policy in terms of representing art, but in a different way. And we're using the space so that it's activated particularly through events, in addition to exhibitions, by someone that can actually organize them and lead a program around collective learning that is not directly associated to contemporary art as we know it, but interested in contemporary culture as it happens. And I think that first is or in parallel, is the rethinking of the uses of the space. Secondly, it's rethinking of hiring policies to be able to include other voices and other sensibilities within the program. And third, and I think that that's actually a quite challenging one still, is to be able to create environments that are more hospitable to a general audience that is not, again, an expert in the arts, but that wants to come to the fore. And when I say it's the most difficult one, is that because you get involved in other things, but it has to do with actually not only being more welcoming, because of course always books and art, even though that's part of the tools that you need in the type of institutions that we are, because we speak about them, we speak with them, we workshop with them. There's a question of food, And when I say it's more difficult, is because when you introduce food, you need so many other permits that as a presentation institution we don't not necessarily have. So we have created a type of cantina there that is very, very, very basic, and that we are framing under visitor services. So not as a cafe or as a restaurant, of course, because we cannot have that, but instead as a visitor service situation there. The most important thing of the changes that have happened there is the name of the space, because we haven't changed the entire name of Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, but as I said, we're beginning in a way through layers and progressively. And the name of that space, of that entire gallery, which is in the ground floor, is called Meli. And Meli is not a name that I gave it. It's a name that a group of youngsters that have participated in our collective learning program have given it. So we opened the space, we hired Jesse Koyman, and we launched a program called Work, Learn, Trajectory. A program that will, that's an open call, and I can also explain how that open call was, that is done for youngsters from Rotterdam, young people between the ages of 17 and 24, that want to learn about art and entrepreneurship. Meaning they're not going to be trained there as artists nor as curators. They're going to be trained there to be decision makers. And we're going to use art as a tool for that. And our neighborhood, which is filled with businesses, I said, it's gentrified, as a model, say, entrepreneurship to develop things, to make things happen. It's a 6-month program. And every session, we're in our second session now. The first group had 6 months of working together. There were 14 youngsters to begin, and there's a dropout rate as usual. That ended up being 9. Right now in our second one, we just began last week, and there are 14 again, and my hope is that the 14 keep. And each of the 6 months has an end goal of one activity that will allow us to create, again, those changes that are required for our institution to transform with a new name, or before a new name. The first group was from September 2018 until February 2019. And their entire 6-month workshop of Work, Learn, Trajectory was to think about identity. So in the arts, as a tool, we thought about representation, but in the entrepreneurship, they thought about branding. Meaning there were 6 months of sessions in which workshops, field trips, discussions on site, and activities allowed them to understand the distinctions between identity, as in culture, and branding, as in logos. And at the end of their course, they had throughout the course, they were being prepared so that they could propose the new name of this gallery space, of the ground floor. So they come up with a name, Meli, based, of all, from a billboard that hangs outside our building that was done in our first year of launching the institution in 1990. It's a billboard by an artist called Ken Lam. And Ken Lam, originally from Canada and now based in the United States, was not only one of the first artists that exhibited at Witte de With when he was very young. He had a huge solo show there, and did this project of what the youngsters themselves called a proto-meme. It was a billboard done in 2 things. He comes from the Vancouver Conceptual Art School, Ken Lam. I don't know if anyone knows his work, but he was a very important artist, and he's still very important, but lesser active or lesser known as he was in the 1990s. So the youngsters called this a proto-meme, and it was a billboard, or is a billboard because it's still hanging in our building for 30 years, that consists of 2 images. An image of a woman, who is purportedly called Meli Sham, and a text next to it that says Meli Sham hates her job. And the youngsters, being 17, 18, 19, the oldest was 23, now he's 24. They said, what do you mean we can change the name? I said, not of Witte de With in general. I said, just change the name of this gallery space in the ground floor. And it will have its own identity, and it will be your name, the name that you think. When they came up with Meli, they came up because for them, Meli was not only a proto-meme, but also was what they had recognized the city center for. Meaning if someone showed them an image of Meli Sham hates her job, which is a major public artwork now in Rotterdam, they recognized it with being from Rotterdam. Not only because it's an image that has been there for all their lives, but it's also because many of them, like many people in Rotterdam, were immigrants, and they felt that everyone is like Melly in a couple of regards, and that everyone has felt like Melly in many regards. They had proposed 200 names, then they filtered it to eventually 3 names after numerous workshops. And when Melly ended, it was as the name. It was also because they said, we want it to be about our neighbors. Meaning, Melly should be a space that actually brings the neighbors together, engages the neighbors, engages the neighborhood, and Melly is what represents this neighborhood. The idea of having done this, and I'm going to show you who the youngsters are. Now, I have to say something before that's very important, that's why this photograph. What was very interesting is that when they said we wanted to name Melly, we thought about a couple of things at the institution. One, that they weren't afraid that the institution's critique of a name, Witte de With as a person, would prevent them from also presenting the name of a person as the name of their space, Melly. And I said, I like it. It means that we don't shy away from proper names being the name of a person, right? We don't shy away from proper names, we just take the name of someone else who represents many and not represents one narrative, but the narratives of many. Fine. Melly, everyone has felt like her, etc. Perfect. So it's a monument to the common man, to the common woman. The second thing that I really liked was that the billboard has been hanging in our building for 30 years. And the youngsters who've been there for 6 months pointed it to us. Of course, we knew that it was there, but it was not an image that was more productive than just thinking about our history. It was an image that they helped us read in a different light. An artwork. The name is inspired by an artwork that in fact was commissioned and that is public. So we loved that. And the third thing was that I said, let's do an exhibition about the archives of this artwork within Melly's space, within the vitrines that are there. And they said, we've already researched the archives when we first thought about Melly, and we discovered that Melly has a connection with immigration and with minority groups in Rotterdam and at its creation. I'm like, well, what do you mean? So we go back to the archives of the exhibition, and we find out where it was placed, the billboard, how it was funded, and so on. And when we begin reading the grant applications, the correspondence with the artist, the faxes at that time, and the negotiations with other venues where it traveled, it's still traveling right now, by the way, it's hanging in Berlin somewhere right now, a copy of it, but with permission. We found out that the artistic intent was essential for the youngsters also to define this as a name. And the artistic intent meant that Ken Lam said that most immigrants, and this comes back to the question that you asked about the caretaker, about the nurse. Ken Lam writes that most immigrants, the third generation, meaning their grandparents, not the second or third generation, which means the people that have been born from immigrant parents in a land, that most first generation immigrants, when they arrive, they generally have to take the jobs that they hate. And he talks specifically about his grandparents having moved from China to Canada, and that they were working there in construction of the railroad, and they hated it. And that it was not just his grandparents that had to move there, but they hated the fact that they had to do this, but that it was necessary so that the next generations would have a very different life, a very different set of opportunities. And that immigrants, it's not that they just hated their job because they didn't like to do what they did, it's just because it was not exactly what they had dreamed of in doing. But that they built, basically, not the railroads, but that they built for the opportunities of the generations to come. So that the phrase, Melly Sham hates her job, was based on the condition of an immigrant in a new context, and the opportunities that they had to work for to build opportunities for the generations to come. This was pointed out by the youngsters as well. And all this is to say that they've named Melly. Melly now is, it's not fully funded, but it gets significant funding from Witte de With, of course, meaning we basically program it and we still apply for the grants and everything. In the future, I'm hoping that that becomes its own independent space. For now, it's still Witte de With, it's just called differently. And ultimately, what is important for me to say, I'm going to show you a photograph of the youngsters, because there's many of them. That guy I actually don't know. He was a friend of someone else that he got in the photographs there. But the posters show that's there, and of course Paul is not a youngster either. The photographs there, they're actually posters, which are 12 different artists from Rotterdam and the vicinity that were commissioned after presentation by the youngsters of their name to create posters. They're all visual artists. They were commissioned to create posters that could address in some way the image of Meli. What is Meli? Who is Meli? And so on. And those posters by some artists that are more known or lesser known are ultimately sold in 15 euros in that same space. So you can buy a poster if you want, you can buy a book, you can have a coffee. There's many events, there's events every weekend. And the livelihood of the space has significantly changed. Meli is that's Jessie in the brown. This is Stein, who helped make the vitrines, helped curate the vitrines, and then there's many other youngsters. But basically, and there are tutors as well, because there's obviously all the workshop tutors now remain. The whole first edition of the Collective Learning Work-Learn Trajectory program was conceived not only as any type of course or workshop that you could take, but it was conceived as a workshop that would create, in this case, the first case study of how do we come to change the name of our institution. Meaning, we don't only just learn from the experts and bring all the academics to the table and sit down, which we're also doing, by the way, but we also listened to who we consider are going to be the future decision makers and how they can use and shape the space now as a tryout for what they will be shaping in the near future in the city as well. So it was structured as one of several case studies put into practice as part of our name change process. So we have learned how the youngsters, what matters to them, and how not all the youngsters in Rotterdam, this group of youngsters, but that's our group that we're working with. We've learned from them what is important, what was the process, what are the types of discussions, the types of the dynamics, what are their tastes, what matters to them, for them having created a new name for the space, which is now Meli. We are in the second course, which began a couple of weeks ago, and the new group of youngsters have a whole different set of workshops, but basically the focus of this one is not identity, it's policy. And it is policy because they are in par with us writing the new policy for the 2021-2024 years of Witte de With. So we are an institution that has to write a policy plan as part of the guidelines for receiving public funding that we submit at the start of next year. And they are also writing policy for what Meli will be. And we will incorporate their ideas and their plan with our own funding application as well. So again, all the courses that they have this time are about group formations, identifying causes, identifying, with a fashion designer, Odair, who's there. There's, I know it sounds kind of boring when I say policy or the identity and so on. It's actually incredible because they're very open and dynamic terms. So it's everything about how you express physically, meaning how you embody those ideas. So we have fashion classes to writing courses. How do you actually have an idea and articulate it in writing? It's 2 courses about theory and the formation of subcultures, meaning there are courses that are very, very dynamic. It's very concentrated, and they involve a collective learning program where all of our staff also participates. So staff members were not many, we're only 18 people, but we participate in delivering sessions and having lunches with them, and also, and of course, being with them all the time because they're there Fridays and Saturdays. So again, enduring change for me is a combination of your concepts around education, which for us means learning. How can we collectively learn, meaning not only teach a group of youngsters, but actually learn from them to see in what ways we have to transform. The second one is definitely changing hiring practices at institutions. What are you looking for, and what type of expertise can go hand in hand with other forms of knowledge that are perhaps not so-called professionalized, but that are relevant for transformation itself. And the third one is really, how do we use our spaces? How do we convene people? How do we exhibit work? What do we give attention to? What type of training do we need to actually make those things happen? We have a number of very classically installed exhibitions still, and I love making exhibitions in every style, including the white cube style. And I do think that many practices require that, and particularly I would say practices that are not from the mainstream, that in a way it's demanded by both of the artists and of the work to actually be considered at the same level as in the mainstream, meaning not to be presented ethnographically or not to be presented just as an event and a temporary thing, but also to use the very mechanisms of the modernist white cube. And I think that that's something that always has to be negotiated, because it's very easy to just do event-based things, and actually it's very hard to do just event-based things. It requires a lot of energy. But what I'm saying is that it's very easy to put all the things that are different from the canon in a model that is more respectful of the original context, but disrespectful or unconsidered by the context that you actually want to change, and for sure the canon as well. So that is a very brief presentation of one case study divided into three phases: the one of using a space differently, the one of changing hiring practices, and the one of changing education for learning, so that we actually see those participants and audiences as peers rather than as a kind of top-down level. And what I wanted to workshop here, actually I didn't know that I had to create an entire dynamic, so I was very surprised this morning. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know all these things. But what I would like to workshop here, or at least hear from you, is how you think within your own institutions, for those that work in institutions, or in your own practice as policymakers or as artists, do you think that you can be more inclusive, or that you can be more transformative, not only as an institution or as a self, but in society? And I wanted to hear some of those ideas so that maybe we can actually relate them. Not everyone has the opportunity to hire. I do think that it's very difficult for those opportunities to open. Not everyone has. I had to wait some months until some people left the institution to create a position. I think that that's one of the things, is that hiring practices are great to implement if you actually have the context for so doing. I think that policy is writing policy is very different than actually advocating for it. So you can write great papers, but how do you actually make those ideas change the way in which funding bodies actually address the needs or the interests of cultural producers, cultural makers? And of course, changing names that involve a historical reference is very polarizing. Society, I think that applying practices of site specificity to research where you are very important to not be unvalidated by people that are absorbed and don't want to change because of tradition, which is very important. We're just talking here right now about incorporating those narratives that weren't within those traditions, right? So I do think that one has to always do research historically and not just address the contemporaneity. So great with the MELI because it's there with us and it's youngsters and so on, but it cannot be done, I think, alone. I think you in part have to do the research about the school and to really say that if you're going to transform the institution, you have to know where you stand. So for us, it's been very important to think about exhibitions as classrooms, meaning the whole spiel around we were a school and so on is to say we're still a school. It's just that our classrooms are exhibitions, right? It's that our pedagogies and our tools are different. And so I think that that the arguments are always within our history. We just have to create like a kind of archaeology so that we can draw from the language there. And I think that the name of Witte de With, whatever it is is going to come from the dynamic between our historical research that we're developing, because it's starting. I mean, we're going to the archives now to get these images. I'm doing this in collaboration with an artist, Tiker, who is trained as an architectural historian, but he's a visual artist. So there's a number, again, of components that are artistic, but that involve the case study of the research of our building, the case study of the street, the case study of now Meli, and so on and so forth. So I would love to know from you, and maybe we can workshop ideas of how you can change your own institutions based on, for example, historical underpinning, if you think of the practice of site specificity. I know that here there's a lot of, I know that Maria Lynn's work at the Moderna Museet, I know that she was just recently at Bästa, but her work at the Moderna Museet many years ago really inaugurated, for me it was a reference when I was studying, no? It inaugurated what is called new institutionalism, together with other curators and directors of museums in other parts of the world, here in Europe actually. So that's one model. All the projects that she developed at Moderna Museet there, I think had such a strong visibility internationally, is that the repercussions were very positive for people directing institutions and shaping them. So that's, I know that Sweden has, I mean, that's one example, but I know that Sweden has a very interesting history of institutional development. So, aspects, yes?